Hello. Okay then, I think it's time that we took a look at these PID parameters in a little bit more detail, and we'll see how they work and what each of these letters stands for, and hopefully we'll be able to use that information to tune these values so that our quadcopter will fly a little bit better. Unfortunately, I have to admit that I'm not very good at tuning these parameters. I do know how the PID system, I guess you could call it, works, so I can explain that fairly well, but it is quite tricky to tune these to get it just right, and you never really, at least I find that I'm never really convinced that I got the right values. So there's a bit of an art to it that I can't really teach you, and as we'll see later on, I tried to tune the quadcopter, the basic beginner's build quadcopter. Later on in this video we'll see how that turned out, and it turned out to be, I didn't get it really all that good. And I think part of the problem was, as I realize now in retrospect, is that I was assuming that it could do these fast flips and rolls that my other quadcopter could do that's running on a 4S battery with much more power to play with. Anyway, so we'll have a look at that later on, but let's just have a look at how the PID thingies work. So in order to explain this, and in order to let you get the hang of tuning parameters in a safer environment than actually trying to do it on your quadcopter, which can be a little tedious. You've got to connect up your USB connector, and then you've got to change the parameters and then fly it and see what it worked, how it worked, and try some different parameters and keep repeating that, and maybe you'll crash or you might break some propellers along the way. So it's a little bit bothersome, but I thought what I would do is make a software simulation. So this is in my quadcopter trainer program, and this would let you do things in a way that you can do it sort of interactively while the simulation is running, and you're not going to risk crashing or anything like that. And it also runs much slower than things happen in the quadcopter, so we'll be able to see at a slower rate what is happening. So at the moment, when you start this up, you'll see that we have P at 1, and I can use the A key to reduce that, and the Q key to raise it, like this. So I'm just going to put all of these values to 0 to begin with, like this. Keep going, should get to 0. Alright, now down here I have this block, and you can pick up this block. Well, you can't pick it up, but you can drag it like this with the mouse, and if you sort of throw it like that, it'll go off the screen. You can press R to bring it back. But as we'll see, if I set it moving, this is a perfectly friction-free mass, and it's just able to move whichever way you shove it, and it will keep going like that. And these two markers in the middle represent the goal position for this block to move towards. So in this simulation, all we're doing is moving it horizontally, but what this represents when you're flying your quadcopter is a rate of rotation. So if you just let go of the pitch and roll stick completely, the target rate of rotation will be 0. You don't want it to rotate at all. So this position here would represent 0 degrees per second of rotation. If you move your stick to the side a little bit, the roll or the pitch stick this is, maybe the target rate of rotation would become something like 10 degrees. So in that case, this would represent 10 degrees per second of rotation is the speed that the quadcopter should be rotating at. So this will be the target. And if it goes over here, this would be, say, 11, 12, more than 10 degrees per second. And over this side would be less than 10 degrees per second. And the distance that it is away from this target value, whatever the target value is, we call that the error. So this is a small error. This would be a larger error. So that's that's what these markers here mean. Now, looking at these values here, we'll start with P because that's the simplest to explain. P stands for proportional, and if I'll raise the P value up to what it was before, 1 or something like that, and you'll see that there's a thrust, like a rocket engine thrust, being drawn to the side of my block. And if I put it in the middle, oops, if I can hold it there, there's 0 thrust. And if I put it over here, there's about the same width of the block of thrust. If I move it further away, we get more and more thrust trying to push it back to the center. So if I let this go, that rocket is going to push it into the middle like that. And if I take it over this side, the thrust is going to have to push it to the right to get it back to the center position there. So hopefully you can see that the size of the thrust, or the size of the correction, I'll interchangeably call this the thrust or the correction, because we're trying to correct the error. So the correction, the size of the correction is proportional to how far away it is from the target position. So when I put it right here, we've got nothing. So you might think, well, that's great. So if it's over here, it'll get pushed back and go to there. And if it's over this side, it'll get pushed into the middle and it'll stop there. But if I just let this go and see what happens, we'll see that that does not actually completely do what we want, because we want it to stop in the middle. And the reason is because this is a frictionless block that's sliding around. And when the quadcopter is up in the air, there's a little bit of air friction, I suppose, but for the most part there's almost no friction in the air. So when the propellers try and spin it to the right, it just sort of keeps spinning unless the propellers push it back the other way. So this P term, the proportional term, is a good start, but it's not good enough on its own to get our quadcopter to be spinning at the target rate of rotation that we want. So I'll just put that there. Now I'll reduce the P down to 0 again. So now we have it just sliding around. And I'll bring the D value up by pushing the E key here. I'll bring this up to about 1 or something like that. How much is this going to do? Alright, now you see what's happening here. If I hold this still and let it go, we get no response at all. And if I move it, if I move it slowly, we get a small response. If I move it quickly, we get a larger response. So this is called the derivative because it's not directly responding to the error. So again, the error is the distance away from this point. But the D is derived from the distance to the error in that it responds to the rate of change of the error. So when the error is changing slowly, D will be a small value. When the error is changing quickly, D will be a large value. And you can see that it's not necessarily going to push the block back to the middle. So if I'm over here and I move it to the left, the thrust is actually going to push the block to the right. So if I just give it a little shove and let it go, you'll see that the result of responding to the rate of change of the position is that it slows it down and just makes it stop somewhere. But because it's not reacting to the error itself, it doesn't care where it's going to stop. So it'll just stop somewhere. And if I increase, let me give it a big shove. Oops, hold on. A big shove. It's a little bit hard to get it just right, but you'll see, hopefully you can see that it's kind of slowing down at that kind of a rate. And if I increase the D value up to now, say 7.9, about 8. Oh, it didn't really change much, did it? Now you should see, that's better. So it manages to stop it quicker. So I like to think of the D value as a brake. It's or damping is actually a good way to think of it too, because damping starts with D, which is kind of easy to remember, I think. So I like to think of this as a brake. So when we have a combination of the P value, which wants to push the block into the middle to the target position, and the D value, then we can get something that resembles what we want. So I think I was playing with this before. D value of about 4 and a P value of, well, let's do a value of about 4 for P and D. Now when I hold this over here and let it go, the P value will push it into the middle, and the D value will counteract the P value and slow it down. So from here, let's try that again. So we'll get it to stop there. And by balancing these two values, you can get it to go either into the center quicker with a little risk of overshooting, or you can err on the side of not overshooting and end up with a slower final time to get there. So let me increase the p-value up to about 10, and now we'll see that, oh, that's good. Let me increase the p a little bit more. Okay, so p is now quite high. Now when I let this go, I'm expecting that it should overshoot a little bit, but because we have some damping now, it's not just going to keep bouncing back from side to side continuously. So let's try this again. So we overshoot over there. So what you're trying to do when you're tuning these parameters is to get it to come back as quickly as possible, preferably without overshooting, or with just maybe a tiny little bit of overshoot may be acceptable. So I could increase the D. Hopefully you should now be able to see or be able to intuitively understand that increasing the D will decrease the amount of overshoot that it's going to have. But the flip side of that is that it slows it down when it's trying to go there. So it starts to slow down much quicker. So that D was a little bit high. Let's make it to about 6. That was pretty good. Maybe a little bit higher. So you got to. That was pretty good. Yeah, so it's a balancing act. P being higher will bring it into the center quicker, but you could be overshooting. D being higher will reduce the amount of overshoot, but it makes it slower to get to the eventual position. So P and D, proportional and derivative, are fairly easy to explain, and hopefully you should understand about how they work now. The I value is not quite so easy to explain, and when there's a situation like this, there's actually no need to have an I value at all. But what about if there was the influence of gravity is playing a part here? So now we have a sloped surface, and the block again is friction free, so gravity is going to be pulling it down that way, and we've actually ended up with a pretty good result here. We're almost on the position. What if I just reduce the P a little bit more? Oh, okay, hold on. I'm just trying to set this up to explain it a bit better. Okay, well, I'm going to have to zoom in because the error that we're getting is kind of small. But hopefully you should be able to see that it's being pulled a little bit to the left because the gravity is pulling it down that slope. And we've got a continuous, this is part of the P component that is trying to push it up there. So this outside influence, you could say, in this case it's gravity. In the case of a quadcopter, I think, well, I don't really understand this too well myself, but I think wind, I guess, is something that you might be up against when you are thinking about outside influences that can influence the speed that the quad is rotating at. If there was no wind, maybe we wouldn't need this. I don't know. Yeah, I never touched the I component. I've never had to touch it. I'd never really deal with it, and I've usually had not any problems with just ignoring it. So I'll just explain this anyway. But the way the I component works is it looks, I stands for integral. We'll have a look at some graphs later for the graph nerds that might be interested as to how this looks in graph form. But integral means that it's going to look at the error, so it's going to measure how far it is away from this target point, and it's going to memorize that a little bit, keep it in its memory, if you like. So the longer it spends away from the error, the larger the I-term will become, or the stronger the correction will become. And what that does is that it'll fix this little offset that we get from the outside influence. So if I increase the I-term a little bit, oh, you can see we don't need too much there. So let me try that again. I might have to zoom in a bit more because it's a very small offset. Let me make it bigger so that we can see it working quicker. Right, so hopefully you saw it rise up a little bit there. If I just reset this, so it has to be away from the target position for a while before this I starts to take effect. And the further away it is, the more this I-term will build up, so that over time, unfortunately quite a lot of time in this case, it's actually slowly getting closer to that position. Actually, if we go back to that other one where it's flat, it might be a little bit easier to explain I. So I'll turn the P down to 0 and the D down to 0 so that we're only looking at I. That might make it a little bit easier. Alright, so I is not giving us any response because there is no error. Now if I take this to the left, we'll get a little bit of error, and then if I bring it back, we see that that response remains for a while, and it will gradually shrink away. It's a little bit hard to see maybe, but that is actually shrinking. But it has this residual effect. And now I'll take it to the right, and you'll see that the longer I hold it to the right, the more that response will grow. Oh, it's actually just reversing there now, so it's going to come over that side. And so what we're looking at here is, it's not just how bad the error is, but it's how long the error has stayed in that bad position. So it's just growing and growing and growing, so that when I let this go, the I-term has actually built up quite a lot. And actually this is a good demo too. It's going a little bit further than I would like, but what we can see here is we get an oscillation which actually grows in this case. Let me see if I can get it to where it doesn't grow. So I'll just I'll just quickly put it over there and let go so that we can try and keep it all on the screen. But you can see that we get a similar effect to the P where it oscillates from side to side without ever coming to rest, except that it's worse because this I-term lets itself grow and grow. So anyway, I think I've rambled along about this for quite enough. But basically I would suggest to just look at this first one here, PID tuning, just the level situation, and keep I at 0, and don't worry about I. So I'll put I to 0, and then just practice setting a random value of P. So say set P to 14, and then adjust the D value to get it to stop as quick as you can without overshooting. And that should give you a fair idea of how these P and D values interact with each other. Or you could maybe try setting a random value of D. So I'll say 1.76 for D, and then try and adjust the P value to make it so that we don't have this overshoot and oscillation, and it gets there as quick as it can and stops. And that should put you in pretty good stead for trying to figure out how to do it on your quadcopter. Now, one thing that it's easy to overlook when you're using a software simulation like this is that this is not really how things work in the real world, because in the real world we're limited by physics, and physics says that a certain battery with a certain motor and propeller combination can only apply a certain amount of thrust, as opposed to what we're doing here. When we move this over here and the software says, okay, I need this much thrust, then it just applies that much thrust, no problems. But as we'll see a little bit later on, the reason that my tuning attempt didn't go too well for this basic beginner's quad is that the combination of a 3S battery and the 2204 motors and two-bladed props doesn't quite give enough thrust to give the response that I was hoping for to do fast flips and rolls. It's fine for just regular flying around, but I was trying to get it to match up to the behavior that I get from a 4-cell quad with larger motors and 3-blade props, and it just wasn't able to do it, as we'll see a little bit later on. But anyway, just keep that in mind, that you, in this software simulation, you can increase these P and D values as much as you like, and it will respond quite well. Basically, just keep them in the same ratio, and it should, like, you could make this 143, and this could be 65, and it would probably still respond basically the same. But in the real world, we can't just keep increasing these because we'll hit the limit of how quickly our motors can respond. So just keep that in mind. So for those who are familiar with calculus, you've probably heard those terms derivative and integral before. So I thought I'd just have a look at this graph to show how they are visually represented. Everybody else, I guess, can skip ahead to the next part because this might be a little bit boring. But I've made a function here, just sort of a random function like this to give us a curve to look at. And this red line is going to represent the error that we saw before. So in the case of the block, it's how far away the block is from the target position. For a quadcopter, it's how far away the rate of rotation is from the desired rate of rotation. So that's this line going up and down. So P is the proportional term, and if I turn this on, it's just the same line. And well, if I make this 1, if I take that away, it's exactly the same line. But by putting a value here, we can make it half of that. So this would be like having a p-value of 0.5. And this is the response that we're going to get. So it's instantaneously responding to the current amount of error. And of course, the thrust is going to be going in the opposite direction to the direction of error. So it would be something more like this, be flipped the other way around. So that's proportional, and that's pretty easy to understand. And then we'll go to derivative next, and this is the rate of change of the error. So for example here we can see the block is moving all the way to the left. I'm going to call negative values left and positive values right. So the block has come all the way to the left, and it's actually stops for a moment at this point, and then it starts moving back to the right. So we can see the green line represents the velocity of the block, so at that point it is a 0 velocity. And then as the block comes up, it's moving quite fast in the positive direction, and it reaches a maximum velocity at this point here, and then it sort of starts to slow down, so we see this velocity coming back down. Anyway, so that's derivative, and you probably, if anybody is actually watching this part, you'll know what that is about anyway. And again, we put a value here to scale that by a certain amount. So if I take that away, in this case it's actually a lot higher, but I just wanted to show it like this. And we would probably have that also as a negative because we want to be thrusting in the opposite direction of the error. And we just turn that off then. And so the integral, as you know, kind of represents the area under the graph up to that point. So if I turn this on, it's a little bit slower to calculate. But starting from this point, we move into the positive side, so we have a positive error, and all the while that the error is positive, so from this point here to this point here where we get back and we start going into negative error, this I-term is going to be constantly rising until it gets to about here where we cross over back onto the left side, and then the I-term starts to come back down. So as you can see, we move to the right, and then we move all the way back to the left, and we're way over to the left, so the error is negative, but because of this residual effect of the eye, the response of the eye is still actually going to be a little bit in the direction that we don't want. So it's slow to react, but that's the only way that you can handle, in some cases, the outside influences like wind or whatever. Yeah, so that's how that works, and again, we'd want it to be thrusting in the opposite direction. So these values here that we have, 0.5, 0.1, and 1.2, these would be our P, I, and D values if we were trying to tune this system. Oh, and of course then the actual result that we get is just the P plus I plus D. For some reason this doesn't want to draw. I'm not exactly sure why these other ones drew, but this one doesn't. But the response we'd get would be something a bit like that, with you adding all of those values together. So just in case it wasn't obvious already, the values that we're going to set are here on the PID tuning tab in Betaflight. So we have proportional, integral, and derivative. And like I say, integral, I never bother to touch this. I just leave it alone, and I don't really have too much trouble. And we can set these separately for roll, pitch, and yaw. And this is because the distribution of weight in your quad is likely to be different in each of these axes. So for example, in my beginner's quadcopter thing, most of the weight is distributed front to back along the roll axis, which means that it has a fairly low rotational inertia in the roll direction, meaning that the motors need to expend less energy to get it to spin in the roll axis than they do in the pitch axis. And that's why these values here, these are my final values after tuning, by the way, I've ended up with fairly relatively lower values for roll than for pitch. Now, like I said before, I don't really bother to tune things too seriously. I just sort of get it to a state where it's flying satisfactory for my liking, and then I just sort of forget about it and keep flying. But if you want to see some videos by somebody who knows a little bit more about doing this a bit more seriously, you could look at Joshua Bardwell. By this time you probably already know who that is, but if you go and check out his videos, you might learn something today. So what I'll do next is I'll just show you some video that I took actually after tuning this, and I wanted to show you what happens or what you can expect to see when each of these values are too high, because I find that a lot of, diagnosing, that's the word. When you're trying to diagnose this, it really helps to be able to recognize what the problem is so that you can come into these values and tweak something and change it. And I don't recall having seen anybody make a video specifically to demonstrate how each of these will look when they're too high. So that's what I'm going to show you next, and hopefully that will help. It was a little bit dark, unfortunately. I was a little bit late in the day to do this, but we should still be able to see how the quad is vibrating and stuff just from looking at the horizon. So first we'll look at what happens when the P value is too high, and this is generally characterized by a very fast side-to-side rattle or a vibration. And in this case, the roll axis is the only one that I've raised the value on to be too high. So we can see in the horizon it's sort of rattling around a bit. And quite often this rattling, if it's only small, it's difficult to see. So you won't always be able to see it, but you should be able to hear it most of the time. So I'll just shut up now and let you listen to what it sounds like. So this will give you an idea what happens when the P is too high. And when the P is too low, you'll get a very mushy, sloppy response. It won't rotate in time with your stick movements very quickly. But that can also be caused by the D being too high, as we just saw before. So if it's very, very mushy, P could be too low, D could be too high. Now I tried increasing the P even more to try and reproduce something that I've seen occasionally, and that is that the corrections are so strong and so quick, and the only way that the quadcopter has to correct itself is to make the motor go faster. And if it's doing that very quickly from side to side, you'll get this effect where you can't actually descend very well, and the quad will just go up and up and up, trying to correct itself all the time. So here's what that looks like.
Alright. Actually, I can't. Okay, that's...
Speaking of D being too high, that's what we'll look at next. So I've set the D up to be much, much higher than it should be. Each of these values, by the way, I've had to increase them to about 4 times the values that we saw on the Betaflight screen just before. And now this one is a little bit hard to demonstrate because you kind of have to be controlling it to feel that it's not responding very well. And as we saw before, D is like a braking or a damping effect. So it looks quite good when it's flying perhaps to you, but I know what my fingers are doing and it's not really responding very quickly. It just sort of feels like it's moving through molasses or something.
Alright, D is at 200. Okay, so it feels fairly smooth, but the smoothness is because it's being damped so much. So if I quickly flick my roll stick to the right, it reacts slower than it did before. So I can't tip it to the left and right as quickly. So It's nice and stable, but I've lost some agility, you could say. This feels a bit sluggish to move. Flies okay though.
And again, as we saw before, when the D is too low, we'll get overshoot and sort of oscillations. Now let's take a look at what happens when the I-term is too high. As we saw in the software simulation, we get oscillations. And the oscillations can actually be quelled by the derivative value. So if the D is high enough, the oscillations will not continue. They'll sort of go on for a little bit and then they'll fade away. And these oscillations also tend to be quite a bit slower than the jittery fast movements that we see when the P value is too high. So as I said at the beginning, all of this happens much quicker on the quadcopter. That's why I wanted to make that software demo so that you can see how it happens in a little bit more slow motion. But it should be clear from what we're seeing here that the oscillations are a fair bit slower than what we saw earlier.
So the I, you get a similar vibration to the P, but it's slower and it fades away. Hopefully that's visible. It's getting a bit dark now, but let's try that again. So it fades away over time.
Just to get a better look at the difference between excessive P and excessive I values, I'll play them back to back so that you can see what they look like. So I'll just finish up this video by showing you a little before and after of the tuning that I attempted with this beginner's quadcopter. And like I mentioned before, it didn't actually work out too well because I was trying to tune it to perform as I expect a 4-cell quad to perform, but it's only running on 3 cells, so it just didn't have the grunt to do this corrective thrust that I was trying to get it to do these fast flips and rolls. Yeah, so it didn't work out too well, but if we just have a look at this at the beginning, we'll see that when I finish a roll, and I'm sort of whacking the sticks very quickly and stopping again, and we'll see a bit of a oscillation. So this is, I guess you can tell by now that we could decrease the P a little bit, or we could increase the D a little bit to fix the situation. And I think what I've done is I've increased the P to the point where it's exceeding the actual physical ability of the motors to obey what the flight controller is trying to tell it to do. Now, unfortunately, I forgot to do the same kind of movements after my tune was done, so I'll just show you some little clips of some relatively similar flips and rolls that I tried, and hopefully you'll be able to see that the oscillation or the overshoot that we saw is kind of gone. Still there a little bit. But I think what I'm doing is I'm just pushing this quad a little bit further than it's able to handle.
Well, I think I'm going to call it a day there. It didn't really go as well as I'd hoped. I think we're kind of limited in power basically though, so I'm only using a 3S battery, and these motors are not really the most powerful of motors, so they just don't seem to have the ability to grip it and pull it to a stop at the end of that flip, especially in the pitch direction, so front to back. There's quite a lot of rotational inertia along this axis. So yeah, that's I think I'll just leave my tuning there for now. It's still perfectly fun to fly, but I don't think you'll be winning any freestyle acro competitions with this kind of a machine. I think it would do much better on 4S, but as I said earlier, I don't really want to try 4S with these particular ESCs. They tended to not like it very much. So that's going to be the end of the tuning for this, I think. Now, if you thought that I was going inside to the computer and hooking up the USB cable on here every time to change the settings over and over and over, and then coming back out to fly it again, you would be mistaken, because what I've been using is my Android tablet, which has a really cool app that you can get called Easy GUI, and this lets you connect. In my case, I'm actually using Bluetooth, so I put a little Bluetooth module on the quadcopter, and I can stand over here and twiddle with all of the PID settings and update things over there without even having to touch it, which is a really neat thing to be able to do. So that, I think, is going to be the subject of the next video, but for now I will just thank you for watching and say goodbye.